guys see how he was like slowly like setting them up so when they got to that last question, they had to answer a certain way, right? Mm-hmm. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
Okay, if we're sampling people, we want to get their opinion without us influencing them. But if we're doing something to influence people, then that's bad. Now, let's take a step backwards here. Do you know why people do surveys at all? Why do we do samples and surveys to begin with? It's because they have something they want to have happen. But they need to show proof of that thing happening so they can get funding. So everyone's got a motive, you know what I mean? So someone's like, hey, maybe we could get this business going, but first we need to show a need for it. So they might set it up, the questions, that you answered a certain way so that it looks good for their cause that they're trying to support. Does that make sense? Let me tell you an example. This is a story about someone named Leslie Knope. Do you guys know who Leslie Knope is?
Nope.
Nope. What is Leslie Knope from? Parks and Rec. Have you not watched Parks and Rec?
No.
I'm going to give you a homework assignment.
No.
You need to go watch Parks and Rec, Season 1, Episode 1. It's the pilot. Okay? It's free on Peacock TV. You just have to set up an account. Parks and Rec, Season 1, Episode 1. And if your parents don't like it, then say it was Mr. College who assigned it, okay? Not me. All right. But what's going on, let me just give you the premise of what's going on, is that...
Chris Pratt's in there?
Yes, it's got Chris Pratt. It's got a lot of people that you should know. It's pretty cool. So in this movie, there's this construction site that they were building a building, but then they ran out of funding, so they just stopped, so it was an abandoned pit. And one of the characters, Chris Pratt, one night, he fell into the pit and he broke his leg. So his girlfriend decides, we need to do something about that. And so she goes to the Parks and Rec to kind of complain, and they're like, hey, well, why don't we turn it into a park? Well, that costs money, and they can't use the city money unless they could show that the people in that city, which is Pawnee, that they want a park. So what do they have to do? They have to go around and start getting people to say, hey, we want that to be a park. So Leslie Knope has this great quote where she's like, I've learned this lesson that I can get people to answer questions the way I want them to if I word the question correctly. So she starts going to people and says, wouldn't you agree, like most decent Americans, that we should turn that pit into a beautiful park? Now tell me what's wrong with that question. What do you think, Braylon? There you go, like most decent people. Well, so then if I disagree, I'm not perfect, or I'm not decent, right? The other thing is, like, if I ask someone to agree with me, most people are agreeable, they like to agree. So I would say, wouldn't you agree? They'd say, sure, yeah. They don't want to disagree with people, right? Another question she says is, wouldn't a park be better than a storage for nuclear waste? Is there anyone who likes nuclear waste? So she's coming up with these questions to try to get people to say they want a park. But what's funny is that even when she has these questions, people are still like, no, I don't like parks. And so she has to rebuttal with, well, what if I told you 9 out of 10 meth users said the same thing that you just said? Well, now what does that do? It makes the people think like, oh, now I'm like basically like a meth user. So anyway, it's pretty funny. So I think if you have time, you should watch Parks and Rec Season 1, Episode 1, and say, what does it teach us about bias and about surveying, okay? All right, let's jump back. We're going to finish up our notes super fast so you can get to your assignment. Yeah, there's not a whole lot left here. So, right here, we want to ask questions that are easy to answer.
So we're not supposed to make the results how we want them?
No, you need to just ask good questions.
That's what everyone does in statistics. I don't want to be playing the losing game.
So here are some examples of bad survey questions. We already talked about the biased and leading questions like what was on Parks and Rec, or in that other video where he was setting them up. Other times they'll ask you 2 questions like, do you have a good relationship with your friends and family? Why is that a bad question?
Because friends and family.
There's 2 questions in one, right?
Yeah.
And I saw one, like it was talking about, do you feel that this presidential candidate has the skills and leadership necessary to be a good president? Well, that's 2 questions, right? Because skills is different from leadership. So it's like, how do you answer both of those? Okay, there's another one which is double negatives. Okay? Do you guys know what a double negative is? A double negative is when you use two negatives in a statement, such as, so if I say, would you disagree, that's a negative. But then if I said, would you disagree that we should not do this? Well, then that not and the dis kind of cancel each other out, but that just gets really confusing, right? Would you disagree that we should not put restrictions on firearms? It's like, wait, so then how do I answer that question? You see how that gets confusing real quick? The other thing is sometimes the way people dress, the way that people act, is going to be different. Like, if it's an attractive young female, then boys might answer different than if it was an old man. Does that make sense? So the person asking the question can influence them too. These are all ways that we can lead to bias, which we don't want. Okay? Last thing we're going to talk about, really easy, what is the difference between an observational study and an experiment? In an observational study, what are you doing?
Nothing.
You're watching.
You don't do anything.
You don't make any changes, you just watch. Does anyone know who this is?
No.
Who is it, Antonio? She's a monkey lady, Jane Goodall. She spent decades just observing monkeys and their interactions with each other, and now she's known as a monkey lady, right? Okay? Have you ever watched this show?
Yeah.
What they do is they just set up scenarios and see how people react. Observational studies. Now what's nice about observational studies is we can watch and kind of learn things, but they don't really show cause and effect. If we want to show cause and effect, we have to do experiments. Okay? Because sometimes when we're just observing, then things might just happen for one reason or another, but there might be a lurking variable that we're unaware of. So what we want to do is a controlled experiment. In an experiment, you have two groups. You have your control group and your variable group. The variable group is where you make changes, and the control group is where you keep things the same. So for example, for me as a teacher, if I said, does homework make a difference? What I wouldn't do is I wouldn't say, hey, this year I'm not going to assign any homework to any of my students, and let's just see what their grades look like. What I would want to do is maybe say on A days I'm doing homework, B days I'm not doing homework, and then compare those. The reason is, what if we had something weird happen, like, I don't know, a worldwide pandemic, that might influence things as well, right? So a control group makes it so that you're better at comparing things, okay? How many of you guys did a science fair project growing up? What did you do? What did you do?
Crap.
What did you do, Jade?
Oh. I don't remember.
Isaac, do you remember yours?
I think it was like dry ice in a bowl.
And so what were you trying to determine there?
How big the bowl can get without.
Okay, so you're adding amounts, so you're making changes by adding?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Skylar, do you remember yours?
I did something about like the moon phases.
Okay.
Because it was the last month. It was like the morning.
The night before, it's like, let's just get
I'm
this
like,
done.
Mom, the science
Yeah.
fair is tomorrow.
Me and my best friend did the same thing, and she got first place. We did it
I
the
know.
morning. Yeah, we did it the morning before.
But like you kids, those are the ones that take time, and so we do like over
I think
weeks.
they said the
But
things.
you
So-
got that big one.
My daughter did a science fair project maybe it was 2 years ago. I think it was last year. She's like in first grade, so do you know what that means?
You do it, yeah.
I did the science fair project, but I
Yeah.
tried to get her involved as much as we could. But we did an experiment to see, does the baking soda, what role does baking soda make in cookies, and does it affect the taste? So what we did is we made a batch of cookies with the normal amount of baking soda. We did a batch of cookies with no baking soda, and then we did a batch with double. And so we were controlling like the amounts. Now the variable here was the amounts of baking soda. And then we were looking at the response to see which ones did people like the best, which ones were the tastiest to eat.
sneak this to your wife.
So anyway, with an experiment, what's nice is we could show cause and effect, whereas with observational studies, we can't show cause and effect. Let me give you a quick example and we'll call that good. Does smoking cause lung cancer? How
Yeah.
do we know that?
Because people who smoke get lung cancer.
Now, that's a good observation. People who smoke get lung cancer, but does that mean it causes it? Or are there other variables such as like genetics or healthiness or diet that make that difference? So that has been an argument for decades, right? The only way we can really settle that is to do an experiment. Now, this is what it would look like. We would take two groups of people as similar as possible, and we would say this group you don't smoke, this group you smoke this many cigarettes per day, and then let's see who dies first. What's the problem
Wow.
with that?
That's
It's inhumane, it's unethical. So can we do an experiment there? No, but are there other ways we can gather data? Yes, and we have years and years of data, overwhelming amounts that kind of show that. But in general, experiments are how you show cause and effect. Observational studies, they help us to start to see relationships, but they don't show cause and effect. Alright, that is our lesson for today. So what you're going to do now is get out your Chromebook. And there's going to be an assignment similar to what we did last time. Let me show you where that is. Boom. So in Module 9, which is on statistics, do you see this one right here that says practice for collecting data, Tuesday 511? You're going to spend the last little bit here just going over that. You can work together, you can work with your neighbors, you can ask me for help. Well, let's just have everyone working for this last little bit. Thanks, guys.